Back in March of 2022, Tracy Wolff, the author of the wildly successful YA paranormal romance series Crave, was sued for copyright infringement. This was a story that rocked the literary world, especially after The New Yorker published an article about this lawsuit in January of last year. The article sparked a lot of backlash, and based on the very limited public knowledge of the details about this case, people were generally on the side of the plaintiff, a woman by the name of Lynne Freeman. Freeman claimed that her agent at the time, a woman by the name of Emily Sylvan Kim, used her draft of her novel called Blue Moon Rising to help create Crave. Kim was Freeman's literary agent from 2010 to 2014, but she also worked as Tracy Wolff's literary agent since 2007. Freeman also claimed that the CEO of Entangled Publishing and the editorial director both knew about the existence of Blue Moon Rising and still copied from it. Without public access to Blue Moon Rising and going off of Freeman's claims alone, it seemed like she had a valid point. However, on March 16, 2026, this year, the court released a summary judgment giving an opinion on the matter of substantial similarity. In the 157-page document, Judge Colleen McMahon comes to the conclusion that there is no substantial similarity between Blue Moon Rising and Crave, ruling in favor of the defendants and effectively dismissing the case. After the summary judgment was released, Tracy Wolff shared some notable quotes from the opinion, along with statements from herself and her agent about the situation. And personally, the outcome of this case was one that I was very interested in, particularly in the precedent that it would set for future copyright claims, specifically given two other very popular YA romantasy titles that seem to cause a lot of controversy on the internet. So I read the 157-page document, and when I tell you that it is one of the most bizarre things I've ever read as a booktuber, I almost couldn't believe that it was real. Lynne Freeman, the plaintiff in this case, tried to claim that she had copyright protection over phrases like, "He gives me a knowing look," and "everything is going to be okay." She also subtly tried to claim that Alaska as a setting for a book is original to her. Oh, and having diverse characters is copyrightable. Now, for legal purposes, I am summarizing. I'm paraphrasing based on these court documents, so take that into consideration. But based on my interpretation of the text, these are just some of the many claims that Freeman makes in this lawsuit. And in this video, I will be giving you all the highlights and juicy details. I've read the document, deciphered the legal jargon, and can now give you a comprehensive summary about this lawsuit. So without further ado, hello. Welcome back. It is a new day, a new sleigh, and a new video where I have something to say, and today I will be diving deep into the Tracy Wolff copyright lawsuit. Now, naturally, with a video like this, I do have to lay out some disclaimers. I'm gonna preface that I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a practicing attorney, nor do I have any adjacent experience to the legal field. My credentials are only that I am a book reviewer, I have access to Google, and I did take a course in entertainment law, which as a side note, I'm gonna recommend to anyone that is trying to enter the entertainment field. You should know how to read a contract. And especially given this lawsuit, you need to know the basics about copyright. Most importantly, I'm going to preface that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be based on my own opinion. I will specify when I'm quoting directly from the document, but for the most part, I will be paraphrasing. So just to cover my bases, I will specify if I'm quoting directly from the document. Anything outside of that is my opinion, it's all alleged, and is not a reflection on neither the defendants in this case nor the plaintiff. And most importantly, without having read Blue Moon Rising myself, we can really only go off of the recommendations of the court. And as my final disclaimer, I highly recommend that you all read this document for yourselves. If not, for the sheer fact that Judge McMahon has to be one of the funniest writers that I've read in a long time. You know, when I set out to read this document, I thought it was just going to be more of a report, very factual, stiff, without any life in it. But there are some moments, especially in the footnotes, where you can hear the fatigue and exasperation of this woman. I will include a few examples in this video, but truly it's something you need to experience for yourself. I never thought I would laugh reading a court document like I did in this one. And all I can say is that that I think summary judgments are turning into my new favorite genre of reading. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the rest of this video. First, I'm going to establish some background about this case. Tracy Wolff wasn't the only person named in this specific lawsuit. There are a few floating around. Other parties included were her agent, known as Kim in this document, her actual agency, Entangled, which is the imprint of Macmillan. Macmillan was also named. And finally, Universal Studios, because they acquired the film rights to Crave in 2020. I'll also give a definition about what summary judgment means. In very basic, very not legal terminology, I will say that it's when the judge kind of gives their own verdict on a case. They basically say, this doesn't need to go to trial, I'm just gonna give my decision right here, right now. And the biggest thing to note is that with this opinion, it is only talking about substantial similarity. This document does not definitively speak on whether or not any actual copying occurred, or if there was any actual damage caused by the alleged infringement. It is quite literally just saying whether or not these two books are similar to each other. Now I'm going to get into the timeline because I think there are some important details that we have to consider. It all starts in 2007 when Tracy Wolff signs with her current literary agent, who we will refer by last name as Kim. In December 2010, Lynne Freeman also signs with the exact same literary agent as Tracy Wolff. In 2013, Kim sends a draft of Blue Moon Rising, or Masqued as it's also referred to in this document, to Entangled Publishing. It is specifically sent to Stacey Abrams, the editorial director of Entangled, who is also named in this lawsuit. In the 4 years that Kim represented Freeman, she was unable to sell the novel, and in March of 2014, their relationship ended. Several years after this relationship ends, the CEO of Entangled, Pelletier, I might be pronouncing that wrong, I don't know, sorry in advance, but basically, she tells her editors that she wants to publish a book that features a character that follows the fish out of water trope. When they are unable to find a third-party author that already had a novel like this in development, Abrams, the editorial director, approaches Tracy Wolff to create the story. And in May of 2019, Stacey Abrams gives the green light on the Crave series to be written by Tracy Wolff. Then, in April 2020, the first book, Crave, is officially published. This next point in the timeline is one that I want to point out because personally, in my opinion, this seems kind of weird. In September of 2021, Lynne Freeman registers all 6 of her drafts of Blue Moon Rising with the Copyright Office. The earliest draft versions of her novel are from 2010, and the latest is from 2016. So, personally, and again, this is my opinion, I have questions on why this would be registered for copyright years after the drafts were created. Or in general, why someone would register drafts and not a finished product with the Copyright Office. Because, you know, artists, creatives, they register stuff for copyright all the time. If you pick up any book, any of the books behind me right now, have a copyright page. That's not weird, but it's the finished work that's copyrighted. Again, I don't know, maybe this is like an industry thing that I'm just not familiar with, if authors typically register their drafts with the Copyright Office. I don't know. This was just something that I wanted to point out. Again, my opinion. So after she registers her drafts with the Copyright Office, she then brings forth her lawsuit against Wolff in March of 2022. The case moves around between 2 judges before finally landing in the hands of Judge McMahon, and the case is reassigned to Judge McMahon on September 17th of 2025. And on January 26th of 2026, both parties move for summary judgment. And that brings us to now, the present, after Judge McMahon has given her opinion. Sorry, I didn't realize how wildly off-center my camera was. I fixed it. It's fine. So overall, the biggest point of contention with this case concerns the access. That seems to be the foundation, that because Kim had access to different drafts of Blue Moon Rising, there is room for speculation that she might have used it to help create Crave. And I say helped because Freeman alleges that it was a collaborative effort, that Tracy Wolff might have been named as the author, but it was also co-written by the editorial director, by the CEO, and by the agent. Now, naturally, Tracy Wolff and the other defendants in this case vehemently disagreed. Kim, the literary agent, only ever recalled sending one draft of Blue Moon Rising over to Stacey Abrams at Entangled, and Abrams testified that she never read this draft. Now, the part that I'm sure you're waiting for. What is Blue Moon Rising about, and why does Freeman think that it's so similar to Crave? Well, as a brief summary, as outlined by Judge McMahon, the story follows a girl either by the name of Anna or Mia, who lives in Anchorage, Alaska, and is surrounded by supernatural creatures. She herself is a paranormal creature, although this is unbeknownst to her at the start of the book. Not only is she a paranormal creature, but she's an extremely rare one, being 3 parts paranormal. It varies because I don't know if I said this already, but Freeman submitted 6 versions of her drafts into evidence. So this does vary in the different drafts if I'm understanding correctly, but she's usually part witch, shapeshifter, and demon. The greater world building of this story is usually dealing in the powers of shadow and light. Our protagonist is the key to the resolution of the story. She comes into her powers on the eve of her 17th birthday. She has a hot, sun-kissed romantic interest that is also a wolf.
All right, this is me in my natural state. Nobody laugh.
Sorry, I'm literally right in the middle of editing, but I wanted to add some extra summary details about Blue Moon Rising. I was trying to be brief, but I'm like, you know what? If you're watching a 1 hour long video, you want all the nitty gritty details, so I'm just gonna give it to you. So the first 5 drafts of Blue Moon Rising / Masqued all follow the same template, as the judge calls it, and it starts with the protagonist having visions, which is a big difference from Crave already. I guess like the big plot background of this story is that a lot of 16-year-old girls are going missing in this town. In general, the school atmosphere is also very different because basically when she starts her new school year, I think it's her senior year, her best friend rejects her, and then this new guy starts at school, which is the guy that she likes. He's the werewolf that I explained earlier. If I did, I think I did. So he's the new guy in town, very Edward-esque, and when he gets there, the mean girl in school claims him. So the protagonist is in a fight over her love interest with this mean girl character. None of these characters have like hard set names, by the way, so I really just have to refer to them as their archetypes. And another big like plot point, I guess I'll say, is that the main character is using tarot cards because she's part witch, so I guess like that's also how her magical abilities manifest, is through tarot cards. But those are some of the big differences from Crave, and honestly, like if you're following along in the document with me, it's on page 10. That's where you get all the details about Blue Moon Rising. I highly suggest you look at it. I don't want to read it all out just because it is a lot of pages. Those were the big things that I did want to point out because the plot is similar, but not really. Like you have a murder mystery going on. They're looking for some lost pendant or whatever, some kind of relic. And that's not at all present in Crave, at least not in the first book. I think later on they're looking for stuff, but it's very different. Anyway, that's the end of my little edit. Please continue.
And overall, the judge notes that these stories do follow the same basic plot and have similar characters. Which, if you haven't read Crave, as you can tell, I am not finished reading Crave. This story is about a girl named Grace who recently moved to Alaska after both her parents died in a car accident. She attends a boarding school that, unbeknownst to her, houses a whole bunch of supernatural characters. She immediately falls for the brooding vampire named Jackson, and the story basically revolves around her trying to get accustomed to her new life at this boarding school while also discovering the supernatural aspects behind it. Again, I haven't read this book in its entirety, and this document did spoil the entire series for me, which is fine. By the time I finish editing this video, I will have finished Crave, and if there's any important details I'm missing, I'll be sure to edit in some clips of me explaining in further detail. But honestly, this court document summarizes it pretty well, and I will refer to that from here on out. The other thing that I do want to point out is that, for the most part, this document is only analyzing Freeman's first 5 drafts. The judge notes that the 6th draft of Blue Moon Rising varies so wildly from the first 5 that it warrants a separate analysis. So this lawsuit that we have summary judgment on is not the only lawsuit that we have floating around concerning the alleged infringement. Freeman also filed state law claims against the agent and her agency for fraud, breach of contract, and breach of fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty, which I learned in my entertainment law class, which is why you guys should all take an entertainment law class, is basically when you sign with an agent or a record label or someone that's representing you, they have a duty to try and do right by you, to sell your book, sell your album, basically to work in your best interest. Freeman also brought forth lawsuits against the booksellers for distributing Crave, including Barnes & Noble, Apple, Target, Target, Amazon, and Walmart. And there is a separate copyright infringement lawsuit concerning the 5th and 6th books in the Crave series. Because at the time of this lawsuit that I'm covering in this video, Crave was only a 4-book series. So she had to make a separate lawsuit to cover Charm and Cherish, the 5th and 6th books in the Crave series. So now we finally get into the deep dive analysis of Blue Moon Rising / Masqued and Crave. First, a moment to appreciate the work set forth by Judge McMahon. I'm going to read to you what she wrote about having to read all these documents. The court has personally read every word of the 4 Wolff books and the 6 Freeman drafts and 9 sets of notes at issue in this case. That was a lot of reading. Each of Freeman's first 5 drafts is approximately 450 double-spaced pages long. The 6th (Masqued 2016) is 108 pages long. It appears to be incomplete. When Wolff's works are normed for changes in print and margin sizes, they easily exceed 3,000 pages, which means the court has read upwards of 6,000 pages of romantasy fiction. To quote Judge McMahon, that was a lot of reading. So in the section titled The Works, Judge McMahon does give a brief summary of Blue Moon Rising / Masqued. She does offer addenda A and B to give more detail into these drafts. But for the sake of this video, I'll just be going off of the summary versions, because honestly, I think they still cover a lot of ground. So some noticeable similarities between these 2 books just based off the summaries include having a teen girl protagonist, a dead parent or parents in the case of Grace, an Alaska setting, and supernatural creatures. There's also the main character not knowing that they are a supernatural creature and eventually finding that out, and having a biracial friend. So the judge makes sure to outline some requirements when it comes to copyright infringement. To quote Judge McMahon, the trier of fact must consider the total concept and feel of the works, which is a function of the work's theme, characters, plot, sequence, pace, and setting, which as a sidebar is how the document is broken up. She goes into all of these details and decides whether or not there is substantial similarity. Again, quote, the proper inquiry is whether an ordinary observer, unless he set out to detect the disparities, would be disposed to overlook them and regard the aesthetic appeal as the same. And quote, whether a lay observer would consider the works as a whole substantially similar to one another. Now, when it comes to copyright infringement in terms of literary works, there are certain things that you can't just claim as copyright. While you might own the rights to your own work, it's the expression of certain ideas that you can actually claim. Quote from the document, because originality is a requirement of copyright, only those components of a work that are original to the author are protectable. That would be like if Suzanne Collins tried to say that she owns the rights to dystopian as a genre, or if someone tried to copyright the idea of a manic pixie dream girl. Along those lines, tropes, or sans affaire, as I'm realizing is a French term, cannot be copyrighted. I might be saying this wrong, I'm not a French girly, but sans affaire is a phrase that is normally used in script writing, and it basically means that certain scenes that kind of have to happen when you're working within a certain genre. In the book world, we refer to some of these sans affaire as a trope, like the one bed trope or the wound cleaning trope, but those are sans affaire. Those are things that happen within certain genres, honestly within all books. I don't think they're relegated to one genre. I've seen them in YA, I've seen them in fantasy, in sci-fi. It happens all the time, but no one can copyright those moments in time. It's hard to explain what these scenes might entail, but once again, Judge McMahon gives a very poignant example, quote, lying under a chicken, sitting in a refrigerator, and facing the possibility of being scrambled or fried are sans affaire in works about the personification of an egg. Not only is that a quote from this document, but it's a citation from a real copyright infringement court case. You see what I mean about the humor in these kinds of documents? I was not expecting to laugh as hard as I did. Now, on the topic of scenes and tropes, both parties submitted expert testimony in regards to these exact scenes and tropes that are found in paranormal romance stories. So both their expert witnesses agreed on the following list of tropes that they say cannot be copyrighted and don't belong to one individual author. These tropes include The romantic lead being hot and dangerous and having an immediate connection to the heroine. The romantic lead warning the heroine to stay away from him. The romantic lead walking the heroine to class and inviting her to sit next to him in class. The romantic lead trying to stay away from the heroine reading books and doing research to learn more about the supernatural world. That list goes on and on. There are a few agreed upon tropes that both these expert witnesses testify to. Another important thing that we have to consider with this lawsuit is how Freeman wanted it to be considered. So she submits all 6 drafts that she ever wrote of Blue Moon Rising to the court, but she tried to argue that they should be considered as an entire aggregate piece of work. And the reason, at least in my opinion, that she did this was so that she could cast an even wider net to try and trap Tracy Wolff in copyright infringement, because otherwise the works would have to be considered independently of each other. Basically, the judge would read one draft, compare it to Crave, find the similarities or lack thereof, and then move on. But she wanted any and every choice that she ever made in these drafts to be protected. And it'll become more apparent in the examples that I'll give in the rest of this video, but basically, it was like if in one draft her character had green eyes, she wanted that to be claimed as her own. And if in another draft the character had blue eyes, that is also hers. So if at any point Tracy Wolff had a similar character with either green eyes or blue, then she could claim that it was copyright. Not only did she want all her works to be considered as one, she also wanted the courts to consider, in terms of copyright, fragmented literal similarity, which fragmented literal similarity means like actual words and phrases that are copied from one thing to the other. Judge McMahon says that this form of copyright is normally only reserved for music. Obviously, it's shorter, there are less words to work with, it's easier to see when 2 songs copy each other. But as I teased in the intro of this video, here is the list of the words and phrases that Freeman tried to claim were fragmented literal similarities between Crave and Blue Moon Rising. Things that she thought she could copyright include things that go bump in the night, pang of disappointment, my stomach is roiling, he gives me a knowing look, grab my backpack and head out, everything is going to be okay, my blood freezes in my veins, the whooshing sound, tears streaming down my cheeks, I'm so sorry this happened, I don't have a clue, I feel exactly the same way, harder than I thought it would be, and to hell with the consequences, and that's when it hits me, kisses the top of my head, and like a sack of potatoes. These are all phrases that she tried to argue Wolff copied from her. In the context that this is a copyright lawsuit, she is saying, to some extent, again, I'm paraphrasing here, that this is original to her, that this is something that Wolff copied from her. And again, we've already established that there's certain things that you can't claim are copying because they're similar in the overall genre. Like the tropes I listed out. She couldn't claim that Wolff copied those tropes because they're not hers to own. But with this list, she tried to say that they were substantially similar and thus that Wolff copied her. To quote Judge McMahon here, arguing that the use of these common phrases demonstrates substantial similarity trivializes copyright law. Those are not only phrases that are commonly found in paranormal romance, they're literally in every book ever. I don't have a clue is unique to you. She also tried to claim that anything that even closely paraphrased something that she had in any of her 6 drafts of Blue Moon Rising constituted copyright infringement. Again, we get some helpful examples. I love this court document. In the 2013 version of Blue Moon Rising / Masqued, on page 57, the quote, "A shiver skitters down my spine" is used. She then tried to claim that in Covet, not even the first book in the Crave series, on page 567, that this phrase was substantial similarity. It's quote, "And then our gazes collide and a shiver of fear skitters down my spine." She said that those 2 phrases were substantially similar. Again, I really have no horse in this race. And when I was reading through the court documents, I really wasn't like leaning one way or the other. There were some things I thought were weird on Freeman's side, but I was overall like, she brought forth the court case. Surely she didn't do it without having a foundation to stand on, some substantial evidence to bring forward. Reading this section specifically, it's page 41 in the document if you want to read it for yourself. I was so absolutely floored. That was so wildly bizarre to me. And honestly, that's really when the turning point hit for me in this whole case, where I was like, okay, some of this stuff, girl, you can't claim as your own. The tactic from what I'm seeing, again, in my interpretation of this case, is that Freeman was trying to do like a scatter shot, throwing anything against the wall to see if something would stick. And I think overall it really weakened her case because she didn't have any solid proof. Again, in my opinion, in my interpretation, I'm not trying to say anything is factual. I think if she had more concrete and damning evidence, then maybe it would have lasted longer. But this scattershot approach is really weakening her overall argument, at least in the court of public opinion where the only juror is me. So now we get into the application portion of this decision. This is where we get into the themes, the plot, the setting, all the nitty-gritty of these books. Overall, the judge says that while certain themes in these books are similar, they're not any more similar than they would be if they weren't in the same genre. As I mentioned earlier, one of Freeman's biggest points in this lawsuit is that these books were substantially similar because of the setting. And yes, both books do take place in Alaska, but again, when we're considering Crave, it's not just the first book. Crave, despite being split up into, at the time of this lawsuit, 4 books, it's considered one complete piece of work. Because it's all the same story, it's just split into separate books. And over the course of the series, the characters go far beyond the reaches of Alaska. They go to New Orleans, they go to New York, apparently some lava volcano island. And the core setting of Crave is in a remote location of Alaska, in a boarding school that is completely cut off from the rest of the world. Whereas in Blue Moon Rising, it primarily takes place in Anchorage, Alaska, which is a very populated place of Alaska as far as Alaska goes. It's a bustling city, there are neighborhood restaurants, bars, and other locations that the characters can go to. And otherwise, for the most part, again, while Freeman planned for this to be a greater series, she's only claiming copyright on the supposedly first book. And in all of her drafts, they never go outside of Anchorage, Alaska. She goes to like a magical dimension, but it's not like a physical place. And the biggest thing we have to consider when it comes to setting is that real places and well-known places can't be copyrighted. If your book takes place in New York, you can't sue someone for also having a book that takes place in New York. You don't own New York. The rats do. Sorry. Freeman also tried to claim substantial similarity because both characters moved from California to Alaska, which is true. However, Grace, our protagonist in Crave, freshly moves from California to Alaska. Her parents died just before the start of the book, which is why she has to move. In seemingly all the iterations of Blue Moon Rising, our protagonist moved from California to Alaska 10 years ago, or something along those lines. I don't know if it's exactly 10, I'm paraphrasing here. But it's a substantial enough time difference that they can't qualify as similar to each other. This plays into the overall plot of the story, which is why it's a substantial difference between these two books. Grace's character arc throughout Crave is that she's learning to adjust to her new life in Alaska. That's the central theme in Crave. That doesn't really seem to impact our main character in Blue Moon Rising. Again, I haven't read the book, I can't really say, but based on the summary that the judge gives us, it doesn't seem to be something that really weighs on her as a character. She has long since viewed Anchorage, Alaska as her hometown, whereas Grace is still learning to adjust. The last thing I'll say about setting, because truly this is the most bizarre part of the argument, Freeman tried to say that these two books, her drafts of Blue Moon Rising and Crave, both had a castle setting. Needless to say, this was bold to bring up in a lawsuit because as we find out, in not one of her 6 drafts of Blue Moon Rising is the word castle even mentioned. Now we move on to the characters of Blue Moon Rising and Crave. Judge McMahon points out that the burden of proof when it comes to substantial similarity is significantly higher when it comes to characters. And that goes for any copyright case. It's extremely hard to prove that any one character is unique to you. She gives an example of just how difficult it is to prove that characters are copyrightable in the case of Hogan v. DC Comics. Quote, there, the court declined to find that 2 half-human, half-vampire characters both named Nicholas Gaunt, were substantially similar, even though both were white males in their early 20s with thin to medium builds, pale skin, dark messy hair, and a slovenly appearance. Like, they had the same name, same descriptions, and even then, the court did not find them substantially similar. So then you take into account Crave and Blue Moon Rising, where even the character descriptions are so wildly different. In Crave, our main character Grace is described as short, I think busty was the term they used in this document, and she has curly hair. Whereas Mia/Anna, depending on what draft you're reading of Blue Moon Rising, she's lanky, dark hair, and she doesn't look like Grace. But Freeman claimed that it wasn't the appearance that made these characters substantially similar. It was the fact that they both experience panic attacks. The supposed proof of substantial similarity is with how the characters manage their anxiety attacks. By, quote, careful breathing and counting their breaths. So I guess if you've ever been to therapy and your therapist told you to count your breaths, they're infringing on her copyright. I'm being dramatic, of course, but as we've already established in the list of agreed upon tropes in this genre, panic attacks were established as something that is shared amongst the genre and is not copyrightable. So already this should be a moot point, but on top of that, there is no mention of the main character having panic attacks in any version of Blue Moon Rising. She even tried to claim that because the characters had similar favorite foods, that was an example of substantial similarity. So there's a few issues that I'm going to address in this section concerning the characters, and they really apply to the overall case, which is that Freeman is taking liberties when it comes to her interpretation of her own work. In this example that I gave, she is trying to claim that her main character experienced panic attacks without actually naming them in her book. In the previous example I gave with the castle, it's the same thing. She tried to claim that her setting included a castle when she never even used the word in any version of her drafts. What I'm coming to realize is that Freeman is trying to claim copyright on anything that she even imagined. Any idea, whether it was passing or she actually wrote it down on paper, she's trying to claim as her own. This is my observation, my interpretation, and it further gets supported in one of the footnotes from the judge herself. This is on page 52 of the document if you're following along with me. Quote, another example of the liberties Freeman takes with her own work, she says that both heroines have maternal grandmothers with green eyes. In none of the 5 drafts that follow the template does Anna/Mia have a maternal grandmother with green eyes. So she tried to claim that Tracy Wolff copied her because her character also has a grandma with green eyes, while knowing that in 5 of her drafts, her main character doesn't actually have a grandma with green eyes. Oh, but it gets worse. Quote, in fact, in 3 of those 5 drafts, the heroine doesn't have a maternal grandmother at all. So it sounds like at some point, Freeman intended for her main character to have a grandma with green eyes, but that idea was never transferred to paper. It was never in any of these drafts. But she thinks that because it was in her mind, because she had the intention, that qualifies copyright infringement, that she can claim originality in the idea without actually putting it to pen and paper. Again, in my opinion, it sounds like to a certain extent, she's misremembering her own drafts. She is conflating the ideas that she had for the series to what she actually created. Honestly, it seems like in all of her examples of substantial similarity, it's all very nitpicky. And I'm a person that is very nitpicky, but some of this stuff is so trivial, you could not possibly constitute it as copyright infringement. If we'll remember from the New Yorker article, they highlight that Freeman had hundreds of examples of copyright infringement of this supposed substantial similarity. And I'm going to point out that the word substantial is in that phrase, meaning of substance, meaning of importance, right? But as I've read the document and based on my interpretation, none of these examples constitute substantial. Then we move on to plot and sequence, which is where I argue the biggest differences can be found. I concluded from this section in the document that Crave and Blue Moon Rising are fundamentally different from each other, for the sheer fact that in Crave, Grace's central plot is around her adjusting to her new life in Alaska. She's learning to cope with the death of her parents, something that the main character in Blue Moon Rising has long since moved past. This was another thing that Freeman tried to claim as copyright because her main character also lost a parent. And I'm going to go into that in more detail, but just know that that supposed death happened years before the start of the story. Whereas in Crave, it's fresh in the main character's mind. That grief, that trauma is central to the plot of that story. In Blue Moon Rising, the central plot is the main character learning that she has supernatural abilities and discovering her lineage. The climax of Blue Moon Rising, seemingly in all the drafts, is that she finds out she has supernatural powers, and she kind of has to learn what her role in this supernatural world is. But when you take into consideration Crave, the entire 4-book series at this point, again, I know there are 6 books, quote, any suggestion of substantial similarity evaporates entirely when we move on to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th volumes of the Crave series. There are certain points in the greater Crave series that simply don't exist in any iteration of Blue Moon Rising. In the later Crave books, we're introduced to the second love interest for Grace, and this is Hudson, who is a vampire prince that is trapped in her head. No such character exists in Blue Moon Rising. Not only that, there is no actual love triangle. More on that later, because that also really gets me going. That's funny. There is also a similar scene in Crave and Blue Moon Rising where the main character is injured in some way and their love interest, who is a supernatural character, has to bite them to save them. And you know, to the casual observer, that might seem a little too specific and maybe that constitutes substantial similarity, but it doesn't. Because if you'll remember from Twilight, a book that the judge says is the granddaddy of paranormal romance, there is a scene exactly like that. Bella is bitten by one of the vampires and Edward has to bite her to suck the venom out. And what I'll point out here in my little sidebar is that Crave seems to be very self-aware of the similarities it shares with Twilight. In Crave, which I'm far enough in the book to have read, there's a point where the love interest, Jackson, gives the main character a copy of Twilight and even quotes it to point out the similarities between their relationships. He specifically quotes that line from Edward where he's like, I am supposed to stay away from you, but I don't want to. And it directly applies to Jackson and Grace. So the book is self-aware. Obviously, they're in the same genre. They're going to share similarities. And you know what? I can expect it. Not only as like a little self-aware joke in the book, but also as a pop culture reference. When it comes to plot and sequence, it seems that Freeman is trying to argue not that the plots themselves are similar, but that the expression of the plots are. Quote, Freeman insists that Wolff parrots her original manner of expressing these tropes / sans-affaire, but her examples are frequently not tethered to the contents of the actual drafts, which is corporate speak for she's hallucinating things in her drafts that never happened. Again, in my interpretation, my opinion, this is all alleged. I'm not saying anything is factual. An example of this alleged expression that is copied is when Freeman says that, yes, having dead parents is a trope of paranormal romance. But she says Wolff copied this expression because 1, the parent or parents, in Grace's case, died in a vehicle accident, and 2, the death of the main character's parents caused physical and psychological trauma and scars. Already that is rather vague. That's not even the start of the problems with this argument. In Blue Moon Rising, at least again, the first 5 drafts of this novel, the father, who is the only parent that is ever killed in these stories. In Crave, both of Grace's parents are dead, and they're officially dead. They're not secretly alive somewhere else. They're dead. In Blue Moon Rising, it's always the father, and he's either killed in an elevator accident or in a plane crash, while Grace's parents died in an actual car accident. And the judge says that an elevator can hardly constitute a vehicle, nor could you really compare planes and cars as vehicles. Like, yes, a plane moves people from one place to another, but when we think of vehicles, that's not what we think of. And the other big difference is that in Crave, Grace's parents are dead, whereas in Blue Moon Rising, it's always discovered that the dad is not actually dead, but locked away somewhere else. And regarding the psychological trauma, quote, children are generally traumatized when a parent dies. Suffering physical and psychological scars is hardly uncommon or copyrightable. It's at this point in the document, at least in my interpretation, again, I wasn't with the judge when she wrote this, but I can kind of hear it in the background. It sounds like she's getting a little aggravated about this case. She basically says that everything that Freeman is alleging is infringement is either so trivial it can't possibly constitute substantial similarity, or it's a simple trope, something that is common amongst the genre. The lists that Freeman provided for substantial similarities, quote, include such things as both works mentioning Hawaii and both heroines grabbing an apple between classes, as well as the fact that both novels feature the phrase well, well, well. Those details are so trivial. Again, no one in their right mind, no one with common sense could possibly constitute those as copyrightable. But the reason that she's pointing out all these small details is because she thinks that when taken into consideration, when viewed as a whole, that it overall supports the idea that this is substantial similarity. And this was an argument that I had actually used in one of my past videos comparing Powerless and Red Queen, where I said that maybe some of these small details, when looked at individually, don't seem to be that similar. But when there are so many of these small, insignificant details that just so happen to be similar, it doesn't seem like a coincidence. But even in that video, I did not go as detailed as to say characters saying the phrase well, well, well is a similarity. And again, when it comes to copyright cases, the overall feel and vibe of the book needs to be taken into consideration. So Freeman then goes on to try to argue that both books share a feminist theme, which if you've watched any of my videos, I just love talking about books that have feminism in them, specifically the books that claim to have feminism and then don't. Again, I have not read Blue Moon Rising. I would love the opportunity to, but I have not. So the supposed feminist theme that Freeman argues is in her book Blue Moon Rising and is what Crave copied is that her main character has her first love interest, right? The first person you meet in that book. But then she has a second one and she chooses this second love interest, chooses again, because they encourage her to figure out how to use her own power and to be more independent and decide her own future. And it's this encourage the main character to be more independent part that she claims is feminism. In response to this, the judge says, quote, I will not bother to critique Freeman's notion that choosing between potential boyfriends represents a high expression of feminism. No notes, Judge McMahon. Absolutely none. I could not have said it better myself. Again, this is something that she tried to claim was a substantial similarity, that the main characters in both books had two love interests, all while knowing that none of the versions of her books had a second love interest. The possibility of a second love interest is only ever referenced in the notes. And this reference is literally, quote, love triangle for book 2. Ash wants to protect her. Ronan wants to help her learn to use her powers to restore the balance. That's an idea. That's something you jot down on a napkin while you're out and about in the world. That's not an original work. That's not something you can copyright. The feminist theme she's trying to claim is copyrightable, that constitutes rather a substantial similarity, is because she thinks that feminism is having a main character that is studious, likes to go to class, and is able to quote great works of literature. Not only would I argue that that's not feminism per se, that's just having a strong female character that is intelligent. Again, that's not even common for just the genre, that's common for books with female leads. The judge references Hermione Granger from Harry Potter as having that same characteristic. Annabeth from Percy Jackson is also someone who is smart and likes to study. So not only does the judge say that that's actually very common in female leads, she goes for the kill in the footnotes. So again, Freeman is trying to claim that the substantial similarity in feminism is because both their main characters are able to quote famous works of literature. But the judge points out that in one of the drafts of Blue Moon Rising, the main character actually misquotes one of these works. She says, the passage from Macbeth that is meant to demonstrate Anna/Mia's knowledge of Shakespeare should read, quote, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Not, quote, by the prick of my thumbs, something wicket, with a T, this way comes, which is what appears in Freeman's manuscript. And I can appreciate that she had the attention to detail to point this out. Really, I think this just goes to show that this judge really did read these books in their entirety. Not only did she read it, she analyzed, she took notes, she really took into consideration what the arguments were, which again is what is to be expected in a court case. And like, this is stuff I do when I review books, but you know, it's just nice to appreciate in people that aren't necessarily book reviewers. So that wraps up the feminist argument in this case. And we now move on to diversity. I'm going to try to rein in some of my passive aggressive impulses that I am feeling upon reading this section in this document. But as a woman of color myself, I have opinions. It sounded like, after I read this document, and again, in my opinion, that Freeman was trying to argue that because both books had diversity, that constituted a substantial similarity. The diversity in question in Freeman's works is one character. This character is described as being black and gay, which yeah, Crave also has a black gay character. But the diversity in Crave doesn't stop there. And again, I haven't read the rest of the series, but we have other characters. We have a non-binary Siberian wolf, I think is how they said it. There are other queer characters, and I know in Crave there are also references to the indigenous people in Alaska. Like, the main character is very aware of the native population in Alaska, and she has a genuine interest in that population. Like, she hears someone singing or otherwise like speaking in a language she can't understand, and she's like, oh my god, is that a native language? That's so interesting. Can you tell me more about it? Like, that's diversity, my friend. To compare that level of diversity to having one character in your book of otherwise what I assume to be white people, that's not the same. That's not the same. So not only do I think that the examples of diversity vary wildly from these two books, but I'm also going to say that it's rather interesting for this white woman to try and say that diversity is a copyrightable idea to her. Personally, I feel rather weird for a white woman to be using people of color as a defense in her argument for this copyright case. You know, I would imagine, again, in my opinion, that this woman, who is so obviously a champion of diversity, might feel a little weird using people of color as pawns in her case. Surely someone might feel a little cognitive dissonance, especially when they have one token character. Again, token is the phrase used by the judge, not me. And you know what? I could continue. I could go on and on with these specific details, but as the judge herself says, there is no need to tick off each of Freeman's hundreds of suggested points of comparison between her work and Wolff's novels. In fact, that is simply falling into the trap of looking at discrete bits and pieces rather than examining the total look and feel of the allegedly infringed and infringing works. No reasonable fact finder could conclude that their plots are substantially similar. So that plot and sequence is the biggest portion of this document, and now I'm going to go into some of the more minor details of this case. For the pacing of these two books, Freeman tried to claim that they both follow a similar format, where at the beginning of the story, it's like a slow burn is the phrase that they use, although those of us in the romance community know that slow burn is really attributed to something else. But they use slow burn as a term to say like, oh, it's slow at the beginning, and then the minute she finds out about the supernatural stuff, it really picks up in pace. So basically, in my understanding, it sounds like she's trying to say that she owns the rights to the plot diagram. Again, I don't need to beat a dead horse. We all know that that format where it's slow at the beginning and it picks up closer to the climax is not only common in paranormal romance, but for any book in any genre. And the last comparison that Freeman draws between her first 5 novels and Crave is that both characters use humor and modern slang, which the judge argues that in her interpretation of the books, again, she actually read them, that the main character of Blue Moon Rising isn't someone that is actually very funny. Like, she doesn't use a lot of that self-deprecating humor that we're kind of familiar with when it comes to female protagonists. But Grace does have a pretty funny internal dialogue. Again, I have not read Blue Moon Rising, but I have read a good portion of Crave, and I can say that Grace's internal dialogue is very much adolescent. Like, she is a teenager, she says things like FML, hot AF is a term that comes up frequently in these books. Is it my taste? No, but I can recognize that that's just like common stuff that people say. Like this kind of like snarky, sassy, like self-deprecating humor is also found in Blood of Hercules. Like that's not even unique to paranormal romance. I found that in an adult romantasy. And again, just to reiterate for everyone, you can't copyright modern slang. And now we move on to the mystical 6th draft of Blue Moon Rising. If you'll remember from earlier in this video, I said that there were 6 drafts of Blue Moon Rising. Up till this point, the judge had been only working with the first 5 drafts because she said that they followed the same template. Some of the minor details were changed, but otherwise the same basic beats in the plot were all similar. But the 6th draft was so different from the first 5 that it needed to be analyzed separately. This draft is incomplete. It's only about 100 pages, I think they said, 120. And honestly, the plot sounds very similar to The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. The main character is named Gabriella, or Ella for short. She is a witch living with her aunt and mother, and she knows at the beginning of the story that she is a witch. And I can go more in depth in the summary, but all you really need to know is that nothing about this draft is similar to Crave. Like the first 5 drafts of Blue Moon Rising do share similarities with Crave, but again, nothing more than basic themes and tropes. But I'm telling you, nothing, absolutely nothing about this 6th draft of Blue Moon Rising is in any way similar to Crave. A lot of the characters are completely excluded from this draft. There's no wolves, there's no vampires. They're all witches as far as I was able to tell. Like already I feel like if I picked up a published version of Blue Moon Rising and Crave and put them side by side, I would not think that they were the same. And if it was the 6th draft that was published, then I would compare them even less. The judge herself notes that the draft is so incomplete and lacks any character development that it couldn't possibly be compared to Crave. And again, because it's so incomplete, we can't really give an in-depth analysis as we were able to with the first 5 drafts. And now we finally come to the conclusion of this opinion, of this summary judgment. And if you can guess, based on everything I've laid out for you, the judge came to the conclusion that these books are in fact not substantially similar, thus giving her recommendation that this case be dismissed. And with this dismissal, the issue of actual copying becomes moot, and the lawsuits against the booksellers also should be dismissed. Now that's all the court documents. That's everything I read in the 157-page document. That main portion of the analysis is up to page 80 or so, I want to say. The rest of the document is the addenda, and again, I didn't want to go too in-depth and in detail with all the minor similarities. I think we pretty much covered our bases with the main document. But now we get to my opinions, my take on this entire lawsuit. Which again, take this with a grain of salt, because really the only thing that matters is what the judge said. The law has spoken. This is just my colorful commentary to add on top of it, and what I think this case could mean for the future of copyright in the literary world. Now personally, in my opinion, I agree with the judge. Even just going off of the summaries, not reading these books, and not going into the addenda, there are really no parallels between them. Again, if you were to put a published copy of Blue Moon Rising and Crave next to each other, I don't think the average reader would think that they were the same story. They might identify them as somewhat similar, but again, they're both paranormal romances. Of course, they're going to share some similarities, but no reader would actually think it was the same story. Not, for example, like Red Queen and Powerless. There's a very famous video of Victoria Aveyard where she's describing the plot of Red Queen. She basically has the book like this, so she's not showing the cover, and she's giving a description of the plots, the characters, and what happens in that story. And then she flips it and shows Red Queen. And you know, that's not a weird video for an author to make. Plenty of people make those kinds of videos. But if you look at the comment section under that video, everyone thought she was talking about Powerless. Not only that, people were saying, oh, you copied Powerless. If that's the description of your book, then you copied from her, which is a bold claim for anyone if you have access to Google. Red Queen came out years before Powerless. So what does this have to do with the Tracy Wolff case? Well, a lot. So while this outcome seems to be a win for Tracy Wolff and her team, I don't think that this necessarily means that any future copyright cases concerning literary works will necessarily fail. The key difference we have to consider with this case and future cases is that Blue Moon Rising was never published. We never got to see how it would have fared in the real world if readers would genuinely confuse the two. Not like we're seeing with Red Queen and Powerless. The key question, the thing that Freeman had to prove in this case, was whether or not the unsuspecting reader reader would see these two books as similar. And what I think Freeman's ultimate downfall is that she didn't have any readers to base her arguments off of. It would have been different if Blue Moon Rising was published and readers were flooding her comments saying, hey, you copied Crave. I've read this book before. This is Crave. Why are you stealing from the work of Tracy Wolff? And those are the very same comments that Victoria Aveyard gets every day. There has to be thousands of comments, Goodreads reviews, posts on the internet where people are saying, I don't care that Powerless copied Red Queen. I've literally seen that in a review on Goodreads. I think I quoted it in my review of Fearless, where someone said, I don't care that this book copied Red Queen. I love Fearless. And one of the first reviews that you see on the Goodreads page when you look up Fearless is someone saying, again, who the cares about plagiarism? The trilogy is amazing. Plenty of readers acknowledge that Powerless is extremely similar to Red Queen, or otherwise acknowledge that it was copied. It's bad enough when readers are saying, oh yeah, I think Powerless copied Red Queen, but it's even worse when readers are turning around and accusing Victoria Aveyard of copying her book from a book that didn't come out till years later. And this is where I think that Victoria Aveyard has a stronger case than Lynne Freeman, because there does seem to be genuine consumer confusion along with the examples of what I would constitute as substantial similarity. I think Victoria Aveyard does have a stronger argument when it comes to this idea of the average reader thinking that two books are the same. Like, there are very literal examples of readers thinking that Red Queen copied Powerless. That seems pretty concrete, at least to me. Again, I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of copyright law, but based on what I read in this document, based on the parameters that were outlined in this case, I think Victoria has a leg to stand on. Overall, I would say that I'm happy that this summary judgment came out, and I'm happy that Tracy Wolff has at least some of this stress off her shoulders. And I'm really happy that she made this document available to readers. I'm sure not a lot of people have actually gone through and read the whole thing, and they just looked at her highlights, but making this readily available was very beneficial, especially to me. And I am cautiously confident for what this could mean for other authors that want to protect their work. Copyright is meant to protect authors. It's meant to protect their original ideas, but it's also meant to protect consumers, other people that want to get into the industry, other people that want to write books, specifically by making clear definitions of what someone can and cannot call their own. Because if someone was able to copyright tropes or scenes, then we wouldn't have books anymore. We wouldn't have people trying to create stories because everyone would just be afraid of getting sued. And that's why copyright is so important. And that's why you all need to know about it, especially if you're going to get into the entertainment field. I want to say that I'm happy that it's all over, but it's still not. Freeman still has some cases out there, specifically the case with the last two books in the Crave series, which I don't know what this decision means for those other cases, but I hope things get dismissed quickly. Because as stated in the New Yorker article, the defendants, Tracy Wolff, her agent, her agency, the publishers, Universal, they've spent millions fighting this case. And a case which, in my opinion, after reading this document, seems to be very trivial, I will say. Anyway, that is the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. You can check out this document for yourself. I will link it in my description. You can also go to Tracy Wolff's Instagram page. She has it linked in her bio. And I highly encourage you to read the document and make your own conclusions. This video is, again, my opinion, my interpretation based on the information that was laid out. I have contributed direct quotes from the document, but otherwise, everything else is my opinion. I am paraphrasing, summarizing. I'm not trying to say anything is factual. And again, everything is alleged. I'm going to give that disclaimer because, again, this is a matter of legal importance and I don't want to be sued. Let me know what you think in the comments. Did you know about this lawsuit before I made a video about it? Do you think that Tracy Wolff copied from Blue Moon Rising? Let me know down below. Anyway, be sure to like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. You can also follow me on all my social media at Listen to Kristen on TikTok, Instagram, and Goodreads. That should just about wrap up everything I have to say. I've been talking for approximately 3 hours, and I do not look forward to editing it all down. But I will say it was a lot of fun to really go through. Honestly, I felt like I was in college again, going through citations and taking notes. I was like, oh my God, it was really fun, honestly. So if I have to do this in the future for any reason, I don't I don't know why I would have to, but if for any reason I have to go through court documents again, I'll at least know some of the jargon. Anyway, yeah, that's the end of my video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. I hope you all enjoy the effort I put into this video. It was a lot of reading. Not as much as Judge McMahon, but still a lot. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.